Sometimes a push is exactly what a wrestler needs in order to reach that level, especially if it comes at just the right moment. After all, it was a method that worked for people like Stone Cold Steve Austin in 1997, just as it also worked for Daniel Bryan in 2014. But not everyone who gets the big push has things work out for them in the end. No, sometimes these attempts to elevate someone to the next level fail miserably. But just what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Austin Theory and his infamous Money in the Bank cash-in. Yes, it's true that Austin Theory has it in him to be a true main event star, and this is something which is yet to be fulfilled. But even his most ardent supporters would have to admit there was no success to be found in the ill-fated push which started for him when he won the Money in the Bank contract in 2021. Why were things so doomed for the Atlanta native at this point? Well, there were a variety of reasons for that, reasons which ranged from him not being fully there yet in terms of his work to him being a Vince McMahon pet project at the worst possible time. Yes, this was the period where the boss was on the verge of being ousted from the company for the first time, and so anyone who was associated with him was bound to struggle in the following regime. Not that Triple H completely buried Theory when he took over, of course. No, it's more that he just didn't seem to see the same return on investment as Vince had. And that all led to the booking decision of getting the Money in the Bank contract off Austin by having him cash it in on a mid-card title in the November 7th, 2022 episode of Raw. No, you didn't hear us wrong. Instead of going for the world title here, Theory decided to use his guaranteed title shot to go after the United States strap, with this making no sense at all in kayfabe. And that wasn't even the worst of it as it happened. No, the worst of it was that the Georgian failed to win his subsequent impromptu match with then-champion Seth Rollins, making him probably the biggest example of a failure when it comes to cashing in the contract. Needless to say then, after this disaster, Theory would drop down to more of a mid-card role in the tag team division, with this being where he remains today. But at least he's not the only person who had a botched Money in the Bank contract run halt their push, because only 1 year earlier, the exact same thing happened with our next subject, Otis. Sure, as things stand right now, Otis has managed to find a nice slot for himself on the WWE roster as a member of Alpha Academy alongside Akira Tozawa and Maxine Dupree, with this allowing him TV time on a weekly basis on Monday nights. But that wasn't always the perceived ceiling for the Minnesotan. No, there was a point when WWE seemed all in on pushing him to that next rung on the ladder. How do we know this? Well, because in 2020 he'd be the winner of the men's Money in the Bank contract, with this seeming to all but guarantee that a world title win would be in his future. Except it wasn't, and the reason for that appears to be because WWE had no plans for Otis after he won the contract. So because there were no plans, even though he now had the contract which earned him a title shot at any time of his choosing, Otis would spend the next few months milling around the mid-card, all before ultimately dropping the contract to The Miz before he could ever get a chance to cash it in himself. Was this disappointing? Sure. And it could have so easily been fixed as well, because even if there were no plans to make Otis your next Roman Reigns or anything, you could have still gone with what a section of fans were asking for by trying him out with one of the world titles and seeing if he sank or swim. This was during 2020 after all, so it wasn't like there weren't more opportunities to get experimental and take risks. But alas, that's not what happened. No, instead, Otis would drop right back down to his prior role as mid-carder after dropping the briefcase, and that's the spot he remains in to this day. Sure, there's always the possibility WWE tries with him again at some point in the future, especially now that fans are back in arenas again, because one thing which really hurt his momentum in 2020 was the fact that the shows were all being performed for empty buildings. But we're not even sure that would work anymore, as it feels very much like the moment had passed. Yes, sometimes WWE misses the mark, but they're not the only company who ever does this. No, the same happened in plenty of places like WCW. And one of the best examples of that happening down south would be our next subject, The Butcher, and his woeful 1994 run in Atlanta. Don't remember The Butcher? Well, maybe you'll remember him by one of his other names, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. That's right, it was during the mid-90s that Beefcake, former star of the Golden Era, was brought over from the WWF and signed up to World Championship Wrestling for the by then traditional big money contract. Why had Brutus been brought on board at this point? Well, in the words of Garrett Bischoff himself, he was the Hulk Hogan tax. That's right, it's long been known that for many years Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake were close friends, almost brothers in fact. So wherever the Hulkster went, he always made sure there was a spot for his buddy too. And in 1994, Hogan had just joined the WCW roster, with this making him easily the biggest signing the company had ever made at that point. Unfortunately though, Beefcake was not anywhere near as big of a deal. And so that was why when Terry Bollea started making requests that the two work a big-time program together, there must have been some nervous thoughts in the offices of WCW. But then what were they going to do, say no to Hulk Hogan? Absolutely not. And so that was how we got a main event feud between the Hulkster and the Butcher to close out 1994. And this wouldn't be a feud which climaxed at any old pay-per-view either. Rather, it would climax at that year's Starrcade, with this meaning that yes, Brutus Beefcake is an official Starrcade main eventer. Obviously though, this was not going to suddenly turn his fortunes around in the long term and make him a bigger star than he had been before. No, that was just unrealistic. So with fan response to the feud being negative overall, it meant time would be called on the Butcher experiment as soon as 1995 dawned. What would Ed Leslie, the man behind this gimmick, go on to do after this? Well, he would hang around in World Championship Wrestling for a little while longer and, in the process, add a bunch more gimmicks to his list. In fact, over the next few years, he'd morph into not only the Zodiac, member of the infamous Dungeon of Doom, but also the Disciple and the Booty Man too. Of course, none of these gimmicks would elevate him to that next level, however. No, after the failure of his run as the Butcher, there was simply no making that happen anymore. But at least the whole thing provides us with a trivia note of him main eventing the biggest show on the WCW calendar. And that's not the only failed push World Championship Wrestling was responsible for during its lifetime. No, just a few years later in 1999, they do the same thing again, this time with David Flair. Yes, David Flair is the son of the legendary Ric Flair, 16-time plus world champion, face of the National Wrestling Alliance, and arguably the greatest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots. Unfortunately though, unlike his sister Charlotte, David did not have any of the natural aptitude for the ring that his dad had. And this meant when he decided to become a wrestler himself during the late 90s, it would not go well, to say the least. Not that he wasn't given opportunities, of course. No, being the son of the Nature Boy, David Flair would be getting plenty of chances to get over. After all, if things had worked out and he'd become a star, this could have been the start of a true WCW wrestling dynasty. And even if he was only a fraction as good as his father, that still would have been impressive. So it seemed like a no-brainer to start treating him like a future player after he made his in-ring debut in January of 1999. As we mentioned a moment ago though, the problem with this was that David wasn't particularly good in the ring, and that meant he'd very quickly be exposed when put in big match positions alongside his dad. Then of course there was his heel turn, his attempt to break away from his father. All this did was further show his limitations when it came to not only wrestling, but promos too, with all of that combining to turn fans against him. How would WCW respond to this growing backlash? They'd keep pushing on because throughout 1999 and even into 2000, David Flair would continue to be a fixture on screen, with him at one point joining the NWO and at another point becoming the on-screen boyfriend to his then real-life girlfriend, Stacy Keibler. But all this time, he never really seemed to improve much, no matter how badly WCW wanted him to. And that meant he'd never get any more over with fans. No, he'd remain in that spot of undercard act to them, which was exactly why WCW never went all the way and elevated him up to that main event spot. Could things have been different for David? Maybe. But that would have at least required him to get some more time before he was put on worldwide TV. Back at the turn of the millennium, however, there was a ratings war to win, and so that meant, at least in the minds of WCW management, he had to be put out there as quickly as possible. Still, it could have been worse. It could have been the run another son of an Attitude Era figure got when he hit the ring in early to mid 2010s TNA. Who are we talking about here? Why, Garrett Bischoff, of course. That's right, Garrett Bischoff is the son of Eric Bischoff, former WCW booker, and the man who led the company to an 83-week-long win streak over WWF back during the 90s. But come the 2010s, World Championship Wrestling was long dead, and so this led to Eric looking for new places to work. Luckily for him then, there was another noteworthy non-WWE North American wrestling company out there at the time. And when Eric signed with them around this time, it wouldn't be long before he'd be bringing his son along for the ride with him. Yes, by October of 2010, Garrett Bischoff would have made his debut in the Impact Zone. And while his name was always going to give him plenty of opportunities and lead to a big push for him right off the bat, like with David Flair, his in-ring talents didn't match up to that. Seriously, it didn't matter what the company did, whether it was aligning the Arizona native with people like Hulk Hogan and Jeff Hardy, or putting him in the ring with consummate pros like Kurt Angle who could theoretically make him look like $1 million. Nothing was able to make Garrett Bischoff into a star in fans' minds. Hell, even when he joined the Aces and Eights during the mid-2010s, it all felt just a little bit too much like the company was trying too hard. So really, it should come as no surprise then that by the time 2014 rolled around, Garrett would be removed from TNA television, with him never making his return after this. What was the after effect of such a move? Well, both he and his father would have a major falling out with the company. Yes, it all ended in a bitter way for the Bischoffs in TNA, but at least this motivated Garrett to go out and be better somewhere else, right? Not quite. Rather, after doing a brief bit of work in the indies throughout 2014, he'd largely disappear from the wrestling industry altogether, with this leaving him to go down in history as one of those sons of a legend who were never able to replicate their father's success, right there alongside Eric Watts, David Sammartino, and the aforementioned David Flair. That said, you could argue at least part of the blame for Garrett Bischoff's time in the spotlight has to be put on TNA too, as they had him appear on TV long before he was ready to be there, pretty much setting him up to lose. And it's not as if this was the only time they'd fail when pushing a new up-and-coming prospect hard, as the exact same thing would happen when they went all in with Matt Morgan during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Now, if you were watching WWE during the mid-2000s, you might be more familiar with Matt Morgan as the guy who briefly appeared on SmackDown as a big guy who had a speech impediment and who, at one point, looked like he was being set up to be the next Brock Lesnar. But when this failed to happen, he'd find himself out of a job, and that was what led him to seek work in the Impact Zone instead. Would things go better for the Connecticut native down in Nashville? Not really, no. Rather, he'd find himself in largely the same spot as a big guy who had the look but lacked the experience in the ring. And that was exactly why fans of the product back then never really seemed to gravitate to him. Not that TNA didn't try to get him over, of course. No, they made multiple attempts to do this during the 7 years he worked for them between 2007 and 2013, with these attempts ranging from pairing him up with Jim Cornette to having him join Ric Flair's Fortune stable as he got a chance to work alongside the likes of AJ Styles, Bobby Roode, and Frankie Kazarian. No matter what the promotion did though, nothing stuck, and the reason for that probably was because there were just so many other performers who outshone Matt Morgan. So it should come as little surprise then that by the time 2013 came around, Matt Morgan and TNA would part ways, with him from there returning to the indie circuit where he'd spend what remained of his career. Sure, he would make brief returns to the Impact Zone in 2015, 2017, and 2022, but these were all one-time deals and never anything that was going to lead to something more long-term in its nature. No, today it seems like Morgan has largely left wrestling behind and instead serves as the deputy mayor of Longwood, Florida. Could another return to wrestling be in the cards in the future? We suppose it's possible, but if it is, we don't imagine it'll be happening in a big league like WWE. And this means we'll never get a chance to see him share the ring with someone like Tamina, a performer who went through her own bad push back in 2020. Yes, while for the most part throughout her WWE run, Tamina has been treated very much like a utility player, a powerhouse who can occasionally be slotted into a notable program, either that or serve as a dragon for a more focused upon act to slay, there was one period where it looked like she might be more than this. It's just a shame that one period came at the worst possible time, as it was right bang in the middle of 2020. Needless to say then, with no fans in attendance and atmosphere for shows being non-existent as a result, there was no way the daughter of Superfly Jimmy Snuka was ever going to be able to catch fire like she may have done had there actually been a live audience in the building. But even if audiences had been there, it's not like this one would have necessarily been a home run, as it would have still been Tamina trying to hang with the likes of the Four Horsewomen. So when throughout that year she found herself getting multiple shots at the gold being held by Sasha and Bayley, it never really felt like there was any danger of her winning either strap away. Sure, you could argue that she didn't need to win the title to be elevated, as lots of people have reached that next rung by losing but having a great match in the process. Unfortunately for Tamina though, her matches in 2020 were really nothing to write home about. So it was then that by the time fans returned to arenas in 2021, Tamina Snuka, main event force in the WWE Women's Division, would be no more. Rather, she'd be sucked into the 24/7 title division, that or going through a brief partnership with Dana Brooke. And since then, well, it seems like she's quietly retired from the ring altogether. Yes, as confirmed by her cousin The Rock during a recent interview, Tamina remains employed by WWE in 2024, though in more of an ambassadorial role than an on-screen one. So for anyone hoping she'd ever get a second bite at the apple when it came to proving herself in the main event scene, it doesn't look like that's going to be happening anytime soon. But let's move away from the present day for a moment and back to the 90s, as that's where we find our next subject, someone who made quite a name for himself on both the gridiron and the All Japan ring back in the day, but who never managed to match that success in the WWF, the Patriot. Of course, back when he was a football player or a wrestler out east, the Patriot was better known by the name of Del Wilkes. And it was under this moniker that he was able to become not only a college star for the North Carolina Gamecocks, but also a one-time All-Asia Tag Team Champion on the other side of the Pacific. So what went wrong for him in the WWF then? After all, it wasn't like Vince McMahon didn't immediately try doing something with him by putting him straight into a feud with then World Champion Bret Hart upon debuting with the WWF in the summer of 1997. Well, the answer to that can mostly be put down to injuries. Yes, the in-ring style out east can be tougher on the body than that in America. Then, of course, there's the wear and tear that comes with playing football for years, even if it is only at a college level. And when you put all this together, what you get is a man whose body was already hanging on for dear life by the time he reached the WWF. So when he first stepped up to Bret Hart as part of the overarching US versus Canada storyline that year, he simply couldn't keep up with the excellence of execution, meaning fans never really got behind this masked star, now going by the name of the Patriot, in any major way. But then, even if he had still been at the top of his game, there's every possibility it would have flopped anyway, because in 1997, the idea of the Hulk Hogan-esque patriotic babyface was about as far away from cool as you could be. No, what fans wanted back then was more shades of gray in their heroes, people like Stone Cold Steve Austin. And for as great as Del Wilkes was, he wasn't Steve Austin. So it was that after only one singles pay-per-view bout with the Hitman, in which he was forced to tap out to the sharpshooter, the Patriot's time in WWF would come to an end faster than it had even started. That's right, after losing his last WWF match to Jim the Anvil Neidhart on an episode of Shotgun Saturday Night on November 1st of that year, the Patriot would be gone from WWF for good. But it's not like there wouldn't be another failed push which could fill the void left by him soon enough, because just a couple of years later in 1999, we'd see the same situation play out with the British Bulldog. Of course, while the circumstances that destroyed the British Bulldog's second run in WWF were similar to the Patriots in many ways, things differ in that this wasn't Davey Boy Smith's first rodeo with WWF. No, years before he arrived in Attitude Era WWF, he was a big star for Vince McMahon's promotion during the crossover period between the Golden Era and the New Generation Era. In fact, it was at Wembley Stadium in the summer of 1992 that in front of a packed crowd of around 78,000 people, he pinned Bret Hitman Hart in the main event to become the new Intercontinental Champion. Unfortunately, though, soon after that, the Bulldog would leave WWF behind. And when he returned in 1999, he'd find that the landscape was very different. Hell, it wasn't even the mid-90s anymore, where he'd also served a spell working under Vince McMahon. No, this was in the middle of the Attitude Era. So needing to change up his character then, Davey Boy dropped the patriotic elements of his gimmick and instead went with the character of a guy who wore jeans down to the ring. Needless to say, this was about as big of a downgrade as you could get, as all this new look made the former Intercontinental Champion come across as was a guy working on a building site. And that didn't help him get over in this new era of the company, even if he was given a decent push right out of the bat, where he found himself in main events against the likes of Triple H and The Rock. But then, even if the look had been better accepted, like with the Patriot, this one was probably destined to fail because by the time the dawn of the new millennium came around, a serious back injury picked up while working for WCW had severely limited what Davey Boy could do in the ring. So it was then that instead of getting that third triumphant run in the WWF, the most memorable part of this period of the Bulldog's career would be the fantastic call Michael Cole made on commentary when the Englishman was rock-bottomed into the dog poop, the dog poop, the dog poop on an episode of SmackDown. And that was why, when he was quickly downcycled and then ultimately released from his contract in the spring of 2000, it unfortunately surprised very few fans. But what about our next subject? Did it come as a surprise that this big push in WWE would flop so hard? Well, not quite, because when you take someone like Chuck Palumbo and try to repackage them as a biker, it's likely to fail. Now, don't get us wrong, we're not saying that biker Chuck Palumbo, the character he started portraying for a brief period in the spring of 2006, failed because the former tag team champion wasn't good enough. No, WWE clearly thought there was something in trying to get him to that next level. Hell, this was why they were pushing him in the first place. The only problem, though, was that the gimmick he was being asked to portray had already been done in the WWE recently before then, so it made no sense for someone to try it again so soon. And it wasn't like it was just anyone who'd done that gimmick already. No, it was The Undertaker who'd been WWE's resident biker during the early 2000s. And if The Undertaker has done it, you can be assured that people are going to think of this version before they think of anyone else's. Really then, even if the biker was something that was close to Chuck Palumbo's heart, as it was pretty close to his real-life persona, there was no way this one was ever going to work. But obviously, not seeing this as a problem at the time, WWE's booking team continued to go along with this new version of Palumbo for a while. That was until the failures of the character became too much to ignore, and the Rhode Island native found himself being moved down to Sunday Night Heat, where he was feuding with the likes of Charlie Haas and Kenny Dykstra. Sure, he would get the odd appearance on SmackDown here and there, but it was clear by then that there were no real plans for him on this show anymore, and that anytime he did show up on the Blue brand, it was always going to be in more of a cameo role than anything else. What would he do after this in order to recover? Well, not much. No, outside of forming a brief on-screen relationship with Michelle McCool and getting into a feud with Jamie Noble as a result of this, Chuck Palumbo would pretty much disappear all the way up until he was released in 2008. And after that, he'd never return to the WWE again. Rather, he'd spend what remained of his in-ring career working on the indie circuit, with him eventually retiring altogether in 2012. So because of this, rather than going down as someone who managed to rise to the occasion in the end, Chuck will always go down as someone who was the victim of a bad push. But then, at least he's not alone in that, because the exact same thing could be said about everyone we've looked at today.